Okay, welcome all. Uh, this and that, New Year's Eve, 2024. Let us hope that 2025 will be better, although hard to say right now.
Uh,
All right, continuing on with this will seem tedious at some moment, but I hope we can get past this. For example, I just signed up for the Audible, the official Audible oral version of the Princeton Volume One uh, of Karl Marx's Capital, the new Princeton version. So, whatever, perhaps we can try listening to that at some time, because it's read better than I can read it, and I'll see if I can work out that we can make this a regular feature of one kind or another to just share amongst our little group. Needless to say, yesterday I began talking about, I used the example of Russian gold as a current example of a nation, a nation's economy relying on certain types of exchange. Although the Russians it's not the only thing that they deal with. Since they're into a lot of a wide variety of currency instruments, they're they do spend a lot of time monkeying around with currency and other kinds of forms. Not so much like Marx wanted to necessarily, but they work around it in interesting ways. And and for a certain segment of the Russian population, this is still a good idea because it will allow Russia's dominance at some point if everything else goes to hell. And it could go to hell. Not that we want it to go to hell. It's just that it might just do that. Now, the content is the same as yesterday's, but I added a few more things to make a few points that. So, for example, I'm using the graphic that describes the path of argument in Volume One of Marx's Capital, and I think it's useful because it's very simple. It structurally says we start with a commodity. We talk about the difference between use and exchange values. We talk about value as a socially necessary labor time and describe the difference between concrete and abstract labor. We note that both of these elements are part of how exchange value is developed from, that use value is one thing that is fairly localized. Exchange value is something that's broader that needs to be expanded within markets, economies, etc. And as such, uh, or in the aggregate, uh, there are formal differences, and we can make the difference, as Marx does, between absolute and relative forms, or an equivalent form, the idea of averages, and the relative form that is more localized. And one of the reasons why in exchange in markets we have to do that is because money appears. We need to have money to help smooth um, our exchanges. And so we have the money form, and then we go down to the second row here, and the money form helps to define the difference between among things, that is, social relations among things, as opposed to the material relation between persons. And it's that kind of, um, animals do exchange stuff amongst them. The very basic one, of course, is in rearing offspring. But beyond that, those systems of exchanges are a little bit more complex, although they do exist in sociobiology studies, all those kinds of things, much to the chagrin of some people. But that there is that difference, the social relations between things and the material relation between persons that the money form, facilitates within the context of markets. And then ultimately, we're going to get to money. We haven't really actually gotten the money yet. We're going to discuss money in chapter 3, but there's a lot of detail that Marx doesn't get to until subsequent volumes in great detail. Recalling, of course, as I said, that volume 1 front loads much of what he was doing in manuscript form elsewhere and gets sort of combined ultimately. That, I mean, he wanted something to be done, and and he gets it done sort of just in time for the Paris Commune in some ways. The difference between, and things differentiated during the same time of his life. Proudhon, for example, talking about property as theft, and in general, anarchists continuing to talk about that concept. There are people who own stuff, and there are people who don't own stuff, and the market, tells us the differences, right? Sellers and buyers, mediated by money. In a communist society, there wouldn't be sellers or buyers. It would just simply be there'd be stuff around, and you sort of get what you need, and that would be kind of easier in some ways. But the problem, as will be mentioned in this chapter, is well, some people hoard stuff. It's kind of crazy. It would be crazy in a communist system because, well, why are you hoarding stuff? It's sort of an antisocial behavior because you can't use it all at the same time. Um, it of course annoys people if I go into a gun store and I'm you know for example, I was selling some of my guns, and yes, I have plural guns, or I had plural guns, but I was talking to the guy who's buying it, and I can't remember the context of the conversation, but I said, I only have two hands, I just don't need that many guns, and I think he wasn't very happy about that, but because that's their business. It is amazing how much it's very instructive. If you ever have a chance, you should actually go to a gun store. They're quite amusing. Even more amusing are gun shows, which is even more interesting in terms of American subculture. But anyway, needless to say, money does change hands. Money is a commodity, and we move um, the idea at the front end that we were talking about commodities, but money is a commodity. It has serves that form, and it has multiple uses and purposes, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Um, and now that I think I have an audio version that we can share, and you don't have to listen to me read the darn thing, um, we differentiate between measuring value and the medium of circulation, which is the key point in moving through volume one and then ultimately volume two and three. Is the idea that it's not just about exchanging stuff. It is about the circulation of it, the bigger sort of system of things that move around. And that's where money comes in. So money as a commodity facilitates one thing. That's one way in which it operates. But you can see there's some subtlety to it. That is, it does measure value, or it helps measure value. I mean, that's hopefully we don't live our lives measuring everything in monetary terms. One hopes that that's true. But the fact is, there are many values, or big V value, and lots of little V values running around, and they circulate. And then, and when we get to row three here, we know that some of us can get into trouble as debtors or creditors. I've never been a creditor, but I've certainly been a debtor. And uh, David Graeber et al. Aside, that's kind of what money facilitates. And in some points of view, if you are moving towards more socialism, you might actually be able to eradicate one and maybe then the other. But that's a whole nother kind of thing. Anyway, money is just a subsection of what is the larger thing that Marx reflects on, which other people have created or talked about, that is capital. Marx is critiquing the political economy that evolves into capital, or the difference between capital and labor, which is the big deal at the end. And so what we will ultimately wind up in volume one is to talk about value in process. That is, what kinds of, how is it that this value thing is and isn't money? And then this other thing, which is called profit, which capitalists are really into and very necessary for the existence of capitalism. And so it has less equivalence and is more about the asymmetry, the inequalities of those things, and it manifests itself as surplus value. And at least in one interpretation of Marx, among many, and it depends how sort of fundamental or fundamentalist you get about it. Is it the buying and selling of labor power? Ultimately, it's not labor as in terms of your basic physical activity, but rather the capability that you have and how it's differentiated, whether you know more stuff or are skilled in more stuff, um, whether you're able, the ableist versus, the disabled in that particular sense. So there's lots of little variations. The powerlifting records for women are not as high as the powerlifting records for men. Let's put it simply that way. Generally, and you can generally say those sorts of things, and then you can, devise all kinds of bizarre rules associated with that slight uh, genetic difference. Ultimately, that's a subsection of talking about labor, but then it does have an implication about capital, because should the athletic contracts for women always be less than men because women cannot power lift as much as men, and it really doesn't quite work out that way, and it's really more about audiences and a bunch of other things. But anyway, capital versus labor, and ultimately there's a battle, there's antagonisms, and it's class struggle. And so there, in a very simple nine unit way, you can argue through, volume one of Capital. It's not as simple as all that, but it really, this is it. In nine sections, you can say, well, this is what Marx is talking about. This is his critique of in the 19th century what the dominant position on political economy is. And yes, there are a couple of folks who do talk about political economy all through the period, and Marx is saying, well, they sort of believe certain things, but those aren't, the absolute, or they aren't perfect in that sense. And so I included the link and the video link to the volume one series done by our friend Andy Higginbottom, which is a useful thing if you have the time to watch. This is lecture one for volume one. It's an hour, can be sped up. Higginbottom doesn't speak so fast, so you may want to speed it up a little. But this is his introduction for those who want a kind of simple introduction to what we've been yammering about for quite a while. This is Higginbottom's schematic for the three volumes, and we have the path where we are, when that is talking about commodity and money. That's 1A here. And 1A, money to capital, that's where eventually where we're getting to. And volume one is this first row here. 1B is the discussion of relation between labor and capital. And we will see that he fully discusses it, but it's better discussed as we move down to volume two, which is the second row here. Anyway, volume one, you can see the taxon and appendix, and 1C, which is the history. And that's important because he's a historical materialist. We really want to contextualize this sort of stuff. And without bludgeoning you too much, volume two is about the process of capital in circulation, where we move from the essence of the relation between labor and capital to the process of capital in circulation, its appearance. And that's where commodities and money begins to take new forms. And there is a metamorphosis, and we have been learning as we've gone through volume two and the lecture series associated with that the turnover is the key element in volume two. That it's not simply about the things we were just describing, the essence of the difference between labor and capital, but rather how it circulates in the world. And so we look at total capital flow as commodities. And then volume three is to take on, because we haven't really taken it on in one and two, but it's much more complete, and that is the profit form and movement, the various manifestations of individual surplus value to profit, formation and the rate of profit, the systematic, a dynamic rate of profit, and the fact that because it's dynamic, it's built on a crisis. And this is Chris Arthur's kind of the way he's divided all this stuff. In 3B is profit forms, the actualization of this stuff. And then 3C, which is mentioned in volume one, is this the fetishism, the fetish of these sorts of things. And it is, that's part of the commodity form, and it is mentioned in volume one. And this idea that some people are just driven by meanings applied to or associated with commodities. And it's not the money itself, although for some people, like Scrooge McDuck, it is, but it is more about status or other kinds of things that are more ephemeral or epiphenomenal that come, because we associate it with things like property. So anyway, this is a slide from Capital 1A. We've been sort of discussing the initial appearance of commodities, its necessary appearance, that is, how it kind of is, and then how it appears, the actualization of it, which we'll see more in volume 3. And that is, what happens, what is it, why are these things contradictory? Why are they problematic? Why do they represent antagonisms? Why is it that people want better something or other, faster cars, whatever? Bigger, better. Bigger is not always better in some cases, whatever. And then we have been for the last X number of months going through Higginbottom talking about volume 2, and that is the circulation issues. And I won't rehearse that, but that's and it is adapted from Fred Mosley's work, which shows you that when we look at Marx and Capital, there are a lot of different interpretations, some of which are better than others. There's some that are very devoted to a particular, interpretation and expression, and some of it has to do with, a kind of Germanic or linguistic hegemony. That is, some people think that, well, it's originally thought of in German, and Marx is a German, so he probably thinks in German, so therefore German is the best representation of it. But we suddenly realize, and this is, I think, the advantage of a kind of a more sustainable polyglot language like English, that you can get a better idiomatic sense of what is going on once you see it in translation. And one of the issues, of course, for the translators of the Princeton version is that, they pick the German second edition, which has as a precedent a version in French and also English. So it, at some moment, it's Marx isn't thinking in German. He's been living in England. So, and he worked on previous drafts in France. So there's all kinds of stuff going on. I mentioned yesterday Hans Ehrbar from Utah. He's retired now, but he produced 3,000 slides of annotations to Karl Marx's Capital. And you can find it on the internet. It actually only takes up, is it 5 gigs or 5 megs? I can't remember, but it's not as long as you think from a PowerPoint point of view, but it is 3,000 slides. And then, as I said, perhaps we'll listen to a bit of the reading by Simon Vance of the first new translation in 50 years, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so today or yesterday, we read up to the first break, I think here, up to section 2. And we got to the means of circulation. Well, I'm not going to start reading that because maybe I can get the Simon Vance thing so that we can listen to it together, and maybe even at higher speed, or we'll just do it so we can sort of get through this, and you'll have a complete copy, and there's all those things. So anyway, you can see it's a fairly long little chapter. Now I added some more stuff for today, and what I'm going to read is Ed George's notes. Because I think I got through, I read chapter 3 and the editor's notes and the Marx's notes. So we kind of got through that yesterday without a lot of drama, but it's there for you to read. So what I'm going to do today is look at Ed George does a complete reading of many Marx's texts, but I think his major sort of thing that he's been doing for like a decade, not unlike Ehrbar. It's like the Bible in that sense, but it doesn't have the thing about textual inerrancy. That is the problem for fundamentalist readings of the Bible, is that it is meant to be an inerrant, that is without any sort of error and with sort of absolute truth, the Word of God. Well, the word of Marx is not the word of God, or it's not the word of Marx as God, or whatever. It is more Protestant in that sense. where we allow ourselves more interpretations rather than conform to certain kinds of literal things, and which is automatically stupid in the case of religion, because it's not like we all read in Aramaic, and in some ways we all should learn Aramaic if you're really committed to that, or at least Greek. But that's not the deal for Marx. So, Ed George, Chapter 3, Money or the Circulation of Commodities. The purpose of Chapter 3. Chapter 3, by looking at commodities in circulation, for example, commodities confronting other commodities in repeated cycles of exchange, essentially looks at the functions of money. To follow Marx's arguments, necessary to make a general point first. In the circulation of commodities, money, here in the form of gold, performs two functions, or perhaps money is a complex of two different things, as a measure of value and as a standard of prices. In the former role, which is categorically fundamental, the exchange value of all commodities is expressed in terms of a definite quantity of gold. In the second, a necessary if categorically trivial function, the need arises to measure finite quantities of gold in its function as a measure of value. In the first function, gold functions as exchange value, in that to operate as a measure of value, it too must be a product of labor. In the second, gold functions as use value in function of its personal or its intrinsic quality. So in other words, you got to dig gold out of the ground. That takes work. You got to get it somewhere. You got to sort of refine it in certain ways, or you got to, get it into a form where it's easier to exchange, and all that sort of stuff that we sort of have a kind of intuitive sense of, let's say. This chapter can be divided into three parts. First, we'll look at money itself through its functions. This is Ed George talking about Marx. Second, we shall look at money's role in the circulation of commodities. And finally, we shall look at the forms, some of the forms that accrue to money in the circulation process. So here we're talking about the same sorts of things. We'll be talking about circulation a lot now. Once the idea of a commodity seems hopefully significantly concretized in your brain. Now, number two, the functions of money. Number one, the measure of values. Money is the measure of the commensurability of commodities in exchange. Now, to follow Marx's reasoning in this chapter, it'd be useful to recall the simple equation of value that we saw in chapter 1. X amount of commodity A equals Y amount of commodity B. And to recall that what this equation fundamentally says is that Y quantity of commodity B as a use value is the expression of the value of X, that Y quantity of commodity B as a use value is the expression of the value of X quantity of commodity A. In other words, the value of commodity A can only be expressed as a quantity of another quantity in an exchange relation. A number of important conclusions follow once we substitute for commodity B the universal equivalent commodity, the commodity which through this function comes to act as money. The first is that money, and Marx's assumption in this chapter, is that the money commodity is gold. Contrary to popular assumption, does not make commodities commensurable and hence exchangeable. They are insofar as they exist as objectified human labor. So anyway, it is the very commensurability of commodities that allows one of them to play the role of universal equivalent, the one that sort of allows one commodity to exist as money. So there are a lot of assumptions going on here, and then there are notes. There are Ed George's notes for his notes on the chapter, and they're worth looking at. Fred Mosley, who retired from Mount Holyoke, has a whole thing on this. And, Mosley is one of the couple of people who have written an entire book just on the darn first chapter. Not book one, but rather the first damn chapter of book one. Of volume 1. So there's a lot going on. Anyway, so the notes are useful. I'm not going to go through them at the current moment, just to get through this text and hopefully encourage you to sort of think about, well, this is not quite so hard. And as I hopefully showed by diagram, it's not that hard. It just means for you to sort of get your head around the idea of the notion of commodity is a reasonable, anthropological, as it were, way to talk about how is it that we survive in the world via certain social relationships. And of course, there's some things that are invisible that we treat as money, as important as money. For example, on television, gossip is probably as important as money, particularly when you're around the water cooler or something. There is a certain social capital that it represents. So commodification is not a function of money. Money is a function of commodification. You see, money is just a subsection of how we commodify things. For gossips, for example, the value is not necessarily monetary. It's about something else. It's more maybe in the sense of in family gossip, it is status. It has other things. It has other reasons. So the second is this: since the value of a commodity can only be expressed as a quantity of another commodity in an exchange relation, it follows that money is not the direct measure of labor time, i.e., value, but the measure of the commensurability of commodities in general through exchange. In other words, the noise that's being blurted out of my face, it's just noise and, may not have much value, less value for people who don't like listening to my voice. So, these other values are at work. To say that the equation X commodity A equals Y commodity gold is the direct measure of the labor time embodied by commodity A would be to commit a tautological error, an error that arises from the failure to see that commodities cannot exist in abstract isolation, that a commodity can only be a commodity if it is produced within a social division of labor in order to be exchanged with other commodities. That's why spies get a lot of money. On the other hand, the risk also rises, and spies often, don't last too horribly long, particularly during a war. It is for this reason that Marx points out that the view that money cannot be the direct measure of labor time results from why private labor cannot be treated as its opposite, direct social labor. This is also the same issue about language. And not to get into a philosophic thing, but private language is problematic, and we can talk about that some other time. But it sort of impinges on this, but not directly now. B, price. Nevertheless, to the extent that money does function as a measure of value, it does so in that it takes on the necessary form of appearance of the measure of value, which is immanent in commodities, namely labor time. How long did it take to make that? And yes, it can be quite crass. If you're looking at somebody's painting and the first question out of your head is, gee, how long did it take to make that? You're perhaps not really thinking about what's important about the object. And the money form of a commodity, the expression of its value in gold, is its price. Put another way, the price of a commodity is its value expressed in a socially valid manner. And for Marx, it's a variety of expressions, but price is purely notional or ideal. It doesn't mean that it's real in that particular sense. It's sort of notional. It is sort of there, but kind of not there because it's not fully realized. Let's put it that way. But but what Marx is not saying here is that price is arbitrary. It is ideal, in that it arises not from the natural properties of the commodities, from their palpable and real body forms, but as exchange value itself, from the social interaction or the necessity or possibility of social interaction between commodities. It is notional, that is precisely imagined, but not imaginary. In other words, you need to have someone imagining in order to make something imagined. An imaginary thing may not even be available to somebody else you're trying to express it to. It could be delusional in that sense. Anyway, it's notional in that it is fixed without either the necessity for the existence of real gold or the prior social confrontation of concrete commodities in a real act of exchange. It's just like if you give someone a piece of paper that says $1 on it, may not be actually a real dollar, although there's some things in appearance that will kind of get you there. But that's why people still counterfeit. Indeed, this latter phenomenon that prices are fixed before, not after sale, right? That is, you have to actually sell the thing in order to sort of realize what's really going on, is clearly a necessary precondition for modern buying and selling. Although there's slippage in it, right? There is, as my favorite example is the little dish of pennies that is there on the counter of most convenience stores. That price is not arbitrary, that is, imagined rather than imaginary, despite the absence of necessity for the presence of physical gold in the act of price fixing. That is, price is dependent on both the value of the commodity in question and the value of the money commodity, is evidenced by what happens when more than one commodity serves as a general equivalent at the same time. So you're in a system of equivalence, um, which is made more complicated if cross the border into Canada, right? I mean, there's some shops that'll take your dollars, but what they want from you is actually loonies or Canadian dollars, which are not the same as English pounds, even though they're a member of Commonwealth and blah, 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 blah. It's just, there are certain contingencies. Commodities have as many different prices as there are general equivalents. Such a state of affairs proves unstable and prone to crisis. And historically, what happens is that one commodity, normally gold, drives out the other equivalents. Then there's the long note 4. There's 4, 5, and 6. I don't know whether note 4 is necessarily be read. This is Ernst Mandel's discussion of the same issue. C, money as the standard of prices. Once commodities have prices, once the values are expressed as a common commodity, the need arises to compare them. From the necessity for quantitative distinction, which follows the process of qualitative homogenization, derives money's second and subsidiary function as a standard of prices. The origins of this are revealed by the fact that traditionally the names of the standard units of metallic currencies, that is pound sterling, for example, derived from previously existing weights, in turn divisible into aliquot parts of the precious metals. That is, concrete prices tend thus not to be expressed in, say, X times quantity gold, but in X pounds sterling, or in America, X dollars, which is also equal to 100 pennies, which is equal to 4 quarters, which is equal to 10 dimes, which is equal to 20 nickels, whatever. Over time, the meaning of the terms referring to the weight of the precious metals and to the monetary units diverge. Thus, the monetary pound, indeed originally a pound weight of silver, and the pound of weight are today very different terms. D, the fetish-like character of money. There's a clear element of fetishism here. Fetishism in the sense that Marx discussed it in chapter 1. The development of the technical function of money, its function as a standard of prices, finally obscures its own origins, and the fundamental function of money is as a measure of value. That money's technical function is a matter of pure convention, and that its fundamental function requires of the former universal validity, leads to the money standard of prices to be regulated by law, and also parenthetically to take on a national character, right? Canadians are only obsessed with loonies, which, in American English sounds a little weird. A process that in turn can only intensify money's fetish-like nature. E, value and price. Prices we've seen as the money name of the labor time objectified in a commodity. But we're dealing here with a mode of production whose laws can only assert themselves as blindly operating averages between or among constant irregularities. Concrete labor performed only becomes social as a result of exchange. After, and not before, as Mandel says post festum, we were at pains earlier to assert that price was notional or imagined, as the notional expression of value, it only finally realizes itself in exchange. And so, you gotta, like buying lottery tickets. You really have to go there and get one if you really want to fully indulge in the imagined fantasy of actually winning the 1.x billion dollars that was won a couple days ago in California. And yes, the take home was after taxes was 500 something or other $1 million, which is still quite a useful piece of change for that person. The asymmetry between price and value means that it is not guaranteed that a commodity will realize the price that conforms with its actual value. Without developing the point, Marx notes that the possibility that the true price may not be realized is a feature of the somewhat elastic relationship between price and value, and is not only intrinsic to the mechanism, but insofar as it plays a functional role within it, is a virtue and not a defect. Let us note here that the disjuncture involved in the relation between price and value also leads to the phenomenon of prices being attached to things that have no value: uncultivated land, honor, conscience, virtue, and so on. As Marx remarks further on, since money does not reveal what has been transformed into it, everything, commodity or not, is convertible into money. Everything becomes saleable and purchasable. F. Distinction between money's function as a measure of values and its function as the means of circulation. So far in this chapter, which has been the extension of the analysis laid out in chapter 1, we've been looking principally at money as a measure of value and as a standard of prices. We're about to pass on to look at money as the means of circulation, and an exposition will take as its starting point the considerations of chapter 2. The final 2 paragraphs of this section act as something of a bridge between these 2 segments of analysis. So, Marx notes that for a price to be established, it's only necessarily notional or imaginary gold, but for a commodity to realize its mission as exchange value, it must be exchanged for real gold. Now, as to the power of that exchange is always problematic, but it does compel some folks to, hold on to their paper money that says on the top of it that this is a silver certificate, and hope to Jeebus that they can get that value back. Now, I've met people who hold on to their silver certificates, but since they're still holding on to them, it really doesn't, it's not fully realized, and that's always the issue. The price form, therefore, implies that both the exchangeability of commodities for money and the necessity of exchanges. On the other hand, gold serves as an ideal measure of value only because it has already established itself as the money commodity in the process of exchange. In other words, there's a system that sets up gold with at a certain price per weight, whatever. Now, what this rather dense formulation expresses is this: number one, that exchanging a commodity for money is possible. In other words, the only condition for receiving a commodity is that the purchaser has the money to buy it. This means, number two, that exchange for money is now a necessity because A, it must be turned into money before it can be turned into other commodities, and B, non-money commodities will no longer be acceptable to other commodities. You bring a chicken in, it's not necessarily going to get you what you need at the Walmart. And number three, the gold necessary to achieve the exchange in which commodities express their value is available because it's already in circulation. We're now ready to pass from a consideration of money as the measure of value and standards of prices and the standard of prices to its role in the circulation of commodities. So what's the means of circulation? We talked about a means of production, a means, whatever. Something happens. There is a metamorphosis, a change, a transformation. So A is talks about the metamorphosis of commodities. In chapter 2, Marx depicted the exchange of commodities as embodying certain contradictions. Here he notes the further development of the commodity does not abolish these contradictions, but rather provides the form within which they have to move. The task that Marx sets for himself here is an analysis of what he calls the metamorphoses of commodities in circulation. This concept is so important. It's worth spelling out in some detail what it is that Marx here means. In everyday life, we're accustomed to dealing with commodities as use values, normally as physical objects with tangible, useful physical properties. If a use value is sold, then simply for a payment of money, it passes into the possession of another, and more often than not, physically changes position as a consequence. The old owner of the article is left with the money, while its new owner takes her newly bought use value home with her. But here, we're not principally concerned with the commodity considered just as a use value. but as a value. And a commodity's value is not determined by those properties that make it a use value, but by the quantity of socially necessary labor time expended in its production. Now, instead of thinking of our commodity as a use value, as a physical object with a set of tangibly useful properties, we shall think of it as a value, as a bundle of abstract human labor. Now, what happens to this bundle of labor when it is sold? Before the sale, the bundle of labor, this bundle of labor exists in the form of a commodity of use value in the physical form. Let's imagine of a television set. I sell my television set to my next door neighbor, and as we have noted, I am left with the money she's given me, and she takes the television home with her. This is the sale if we think of the television as a use value. But we need to think of the television as value, that is, if it works, and strip away all of its use value, all of its televisionness. On the other hand, it's just a table or, a hassock or something. If, it doesn't, you plug it in, turn the knob, and it doesn't come on. Now, before the sale, I'm the owner of value, a bundle of human labor time. The existential form of this labor time is the television, true, but what I'm here interested in is the labor, not the form. When I sell the television, although the use value passes from my possession into the possession of my neighbor, my value stays with me. That is, with the exchange, a complete exchange. But it has now changed its form. Rather than manifesting itself as a television, it takes on the existential form of a sum of money. While the physical properties of televisionness have indeed changed hands, what has happened to my bundle of labor time is that it has changed its form. It has undergone a metamorphosis. Now, if I want to use the money that I got from my television to buy, say, a settee or a hassock, again, if I'm successful in doing this, a settee, a soft object useful for sitting on, passes from the possession of its owner into mine while I part with my sum of money. But again, we need to see this exchange stripped of its use value. That is, my bundle of labor time manifesting itself in the form of a sum of money metamorphosizes metamorphoses into the form of a settee. And the overall process, then, my original bundle of labor, my value, has undergone two changes of form, a double metamorphosis from television into money, and then from money into the settee or hassock. But underlying each of the three forms involved, that is, television, money, settee, it's a quantity of labor time, a value. The television, money, and settee are simply the three forms it is assumed. And yes, let me break here for a second and say, yes, there's other labor involved as well, right? But what we're thinking about more is labor time in production as opposed to labor time in my, picking the damn thing up because it's, light enough to carry and then carrying it over to the neighbors because I'm a good person and the neighbor doesn't want to carry it themselves, et cetera, et cetera. It will be useful here to give Marx's motivation for his procedure. It's laid out in the French edition of Capital, for it is clearer than that given in both the English and German editions. You can see how ugly it can get. So the formal movement aspect of this movement of circulation is somewhat difficult to grasp since each form change of one commodity is brought about through the exchange of two commodities. An example of such a form change is a commodity stripping off its useful form and putting on its money form. Now, how does this happen? By its exchange with gold. That's tough, but it is a simple exchange of two commodities if we view it as a tangible fact. But it is necessary to look more closely. That is, when a commodity enters into exchange and is confronted by gold, we have clearly on one side a commodity, a useful, a unity of exchange value and a use value. But on each side of this unity, it represents itself as an inverse and opposite manner. The commodity presents itself as a use value, its exchange value expressed only notionally by its price. That is, money is still in my pocket and the change is still in the register. On the other hand, the gold presents itself in the form of a general exchangeability as the concrete shape of value, its use value only notionally expressed in the commodities which stand as its equivalents. Now, Marx illustrates, and this is the 20 yards of linen again. Marx illustrates what now happens through the use of this following example. A linen weaver takes 20 yards of linen with a price of £2 to market, £2 sterling. She sells the linen and uses the £2 to buy a family Bible of the same price. Looking at this everyday act through the prism of metamorphoses, we see that the linen, for the weaver a mere carrier of value, is disembodied of its concrete physical form in exchange for gold, which in turn becomes the material shape of the value of the linen. This value is then re-embodied in the form of the use value of the Bible. I'll let you think about that in a second. Is it magic? There is a kind of interesting set of relations are going on there. Thus, the weaver, in order to exchange the products of her own labor for the use values that she needs, that is a necessity within a developed division of labor, has to effect a double transaction, that is, of sale and purchase. That is a dual set of metamorphoses for her own original commodity. That is, you get it out there in the market, money comes in, whatever. Even if for her, what counts in the end is only the exchange of one use value for another. In other words, at the front end, there's a use value. At the back end, there's a use value. And then there's stuff going on between it in exchange. The content of this process, what Marx calls the metabolism, of social labor, this metabolism thing, you can see how that becomes useful for people like Bellamy Foster, etc., expresses the movement C-C, C to C, the exchange of one commodity for another. The changes of form that are metamorphoses necessary to bring this about, the transformation of the first commodity, that is the linen, into money, and the transformation of the money into the Bible, describe the movement C-M-C, CMC. Hopefully that seems fairly easy. Needless to say, we see the French version, the French edition of Capital from 1867, the no version of that. Now, for the first step, C to M, to be successful, the commodity must be a proven utility within the overall social division of labor. But the division of labor is an organization of production which has grown up naturally, a web which has been and continues to be woven behind the backs of the producers. This state of affairs leads to uncertainties which the commodity is not guaranteed a buyer. Marx enumerates a number of possible situations in which C-M may not be successfully realized, amongst which we find, for example, and there's several examples here, 3, I think, the commodity may be the product of a new type of labor, may be intended to fill a new need, or may arise out of a specialization with an already existing branch of production, and may, as a consequence, find a market not sufficiently ripe for it. And we know this, some people put out a new product and the market's not, ready for this, whatever the hell it is. New Coke, for example. The need for the number 2 sub question, the need for the commodity may have already been filled by other suppliers in which a surplus of social labor has been expended on it. In these cases, of course, the commodity may wind up being sold, but not for its price, the exponent of the magnitude of its value. And number 3, subsection 3, the commodity may have been produced under now out-of-date technical conditions, which results in the labor time embodied in it being beyond that social necessary. Now, we can imagine in our minds a lot of products whose life as a product has been altered by a variety of these contingencies because they're alternative uses, substitutions, complements, blah, 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 blah. Nevertheless, the case is that the very division of labor, which turns producers into independent private producers, which also makes the social process of production and the social relations between the producers independent of their conscious intervention, at the same time, it forces them into a system of mutual material dependence. Insofar as the division of labor forces the conversion of the product of labor into a commodity and thus necessarily its transformation into money, it also makes it a matter of relative chance whether this transformation occurs at all. And even if it does occur without loss or accretion of the substance of value, the division of labor converts the product of labor into a commodity and thereby makes necessary its conversion into money. At the same time, it makes it a matter of chance whether this transubstantiation succeeds or not. Now, I've run past my time here, and there's a little fair bit more, and maybe I'll complete this tomorrow, you can read ahead or complete it or show up late or whatever. But there's a fair amount of reading that would probably get us to 20 after, maybe more. So I will stop right now. We're going to be in the things evening. There's several other events that are coming up tonight, which I'm looking forward to. So let me stop here. I'll continue this on tomorrow. If you're listening to me, just come on over to theautonomouscollective.net and come on over to Discord, or you can see the link to get here to get to this page in Medium, and all of these things will become hopefully fairly apparent. Needless to say, I hope that you'll stick with me, that you'll be not hungover and relatively conscious when I discuss this tomorrow. I confess to be a bit of a teetotal sort of person, so it's not. Uh, I will be awake, I hope, and simply not. I hope you'll be awake and will think of me and come by on for the first day of the New Year's, and come and ask questions and talk about this. It will go on a little bit. If we reach the end early, we'll start reading from the text itself, and depends how far we get. Not that we're going to begin chapter 4 on tomorrow at all, although we could. But you can figure this out for yourself. By that time, perhaps I'll have figured out how to do the regular section of the Princeton version of the audio reading of Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 1, uh, by by that has been published by Princeton University Press in this past September. So with that, I'll see if there are any questions or comments. Let's see. Joe's barely awake. Um, Teleological is a question. Yes. People talking about other matters. So yes, there's no trenchant stuff other than the request asking whether Scrooge McDuck is a person. Uh, um, anyway, so thank you, everyone, and I'll have a safe and interesting New Year's Eve. You can kill the live stream, Joe. Oh, it's my it's my pleasure.